Welcome, viewers, to our ongoing program, Nuclear Free Future Conversation, coming to you from Channel 17, Center for Media and Democracy here in Burlington, Vermont. And viewers, we have very special guests today speaking on environmental justice and nuclear waste, the road from New England to Texas and New Mexico. And this is their flyer, which they are promoting this tour. And I'm going to introduce my wonderful guests right now. To my right is Diane with Nuclear Information and Resource Services, who will address the vulnerabilities of centralized interim storage of high-level nuclear waste and foreign policy and federal policy. And in the center is Deb Katz with Citizens Awareness Network, CAN, who will address the issues of North Star decommissioning and hardened on-site storage at nuclear sites. And finally, it's Leona Morgan, Nuclear Industry Study Group from the Navajo Nation. Welcome, Leona. And a community impacted by uranium mining and the nuclear fuel cycle. So thank you all for coming here today to Burlington, Vermont. And you're kicking off this tour right now. Diane, could you tell me what is the purpose of the tour with the mock casks that we're going to show on the screen also?
We are part of a team of people from Vermont and Leona from New Mexico, going through Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire to alert folks that there's a big threat of triggering massive nuclear shipments on our roads, rails, and waterways across this country for 40 years unless we stop it now. Nuclear reactors have been operating for decades, making deadly waste that's deadly forever. Rather than finding a way to isolate it and keep it from getting out, what the industry and government want to do is put it on the roads, rails, and waterways and move it back and forth right now to Leona's lands in New Mexico. But it's not a permanent way to isolate it. So we're here to say no to the federal bills that are in Congress. We want the New England Congress members to oppose H.R. 2699 and the Senate bills that would trigger nuclear shipments in this country, and we need to really make it less dangerous at the reactors, and we need to shut the rest of the reactors down that are still operating.
Thank you. And Deb?
Well, Diane did a great job. I mean, she's looking at it from like 1,000 feet up in a sense. So I live in a reactor community. I live 4 miles from Yankee Row. I live 16 miles from Vermont Yankee. We have, since our early inception with Citizens Awareness Network, protested the industry's targeting of working poor, rural, people of color, Native American communities for nuclear waste contamination, just as they targeted farm communities for nuclear reactors. So that part of the work we have done is to broadcast so people understood that the issue of the industry attempting to present itself as clean, as renewable at this point, as the answer to climate change is a farce and really dangerous and has to be opposed. Because what you see, you have Vermont Yankee at this point, and it's shuttered. And you have North Star, a limited liability corporation, coming in now, ostensibly as a white knight, saying they're going to clean the site up. And part of the cleaning the site up is dumping waste on Leona, as if that's a reasonable idea, which is, to us, an issue of morality. It is an issue of decency, that each person has a right to clean air, clean water, clean land, and a safe place to live, and that the nuclear industry, in fact, in their choices of choosing to target people who have the least political clout to be able to defend and protect themselves, basically create this cycle of contamination and sacrifice, and that this has to stop. And what has to be found is a permanent solution. We have to create the best solution we can. We can only move it once, and we have to do it right. And that's not what they want to do. As Diane was talking about, putting it on a rails, moving it, and basically moving it to a parking lot for an unlimited period of time because they have no solution and they've abdicated their responsibility to find one. And we have to hold them accountable. And we need the people in Vermont, in Massachusetts, in New Hampshire, in New England to say, no, the legislators in New England voted for the last legislation to set up interim storage. And they should be ashamed of themselves. And it's our job to make them wake up, to have people wake up, to contact their legislators and say, you got to do a better job because you're not doing it now.
I just want to reintroduce the organization I represent. It's the Nuclear Issues Study Group. There's a little typo.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I am here basically as a representative of the communities in the Southwest. I am my people are indigenous to the Southwest. So we are Diné. Some folks may know us as the Navajo. And our people we have a tribal government system that has actually made a law that forbids and prohibits the transport of radioactive materials through our lands. So this is one issue I really am concerned about as an indigenous person because the railroad goes right by two of our sacred mountains. And so the history of nuclear colonialism in the United States has always targeted indigenous people. So in New Mexico, we're dealing with what we call the nuclear beast. So we have everything from the front end of the nuclear fuel chain, which is uranium mining and milling. So the very fuel that is for not just the nuclear energy that we're talking about here today, but also the nuclear weapons. So that feeds into United States imperialism and capitalism. And we see this as a form of environmental racism. In New Mexico, the people out there don't believe it's temporary, that the waste coming from these power plants would be stored only as an interim, place until they find a permanent solution. So our people, not just the communities, but also our Congress people, our governor, and other elected officials have come out very strongly against the proposal to store high-level radioactive waste in our community. It's not just one proposal, it's actually two. So we have Holtec, which is also, out here, and then we have WCS, which is working with North Star, and there are two facilities which are 40 miles apart in the southeast corner of New Mexico. So we're very concerned, and we don't want it.
So can you bring us up to speed on what is out there now? What are they dumping? They're doing something now, right? The dump is there.
Well, WCS is a low-level waste dump. There is no high-level waste. There has been no transport of used fuel from nuclear reactors. We have what's called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which is a storage for transuranic waste. It's a different type of radioactive waste, and we call it WIP, so the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant opened in 1999, and they claim to be safe for 10,000 years, but in the first 15 years, it already had a massive accident and leak. And the WIP site is only 13 miles south of Holtec, as the crow flies. So there is some waste at WIP, and there's some waste at the Waste Control Specialist site. However, there is no high-level waste. There is no waste that has come from any reactors to New Mexico. On the opposite corner of the state, we have a lot of waste from uranium mines, and then we also have two national labs. So in New Mexico alone, we have several types of radioactive waste, a lot of tons of what we call T-norm, and then also waste that came from other facilities that was transported to Sandia National Labs. There's a place near Albuquerque called it's called the Mixed Waste Landfill. So we actually have a little bit of high-level waste that was mixed in with hazardous waste. It's very close to the Albuquerque airport. Many folks don't know about this, but our organization, along with many, many other groups, have been working to clean up the mixed waste landfill. So with all the uranium waste, the other transuranic waste, and other facilities, we don't need more waste coming. We're already overburdened by the nuclear industry, and so that's why we're saying no. We're saying no to Holtec. We want to halt Holtec.
And Diane, how urgent is this?
Well, if one looks at the congressional legislation, the people in Congress, we've got the House and the Senate, and last year, the House very by a large margin, passed the bill that would have made these centralized interim storage sites, which are actually illegal under current law. The current nuclear waste policy law of the country does not allow consolidated interim storage. If they did allow it, it couldn't happen unless there was an operating permanent repository to keep it from becoming de facto permanent, which is what we fear. So the current law is no centralized storage, and what the legislation would do is make that legal, and it would restart the licensing of the Yucca Mountain proposed high-level dump in Nevada on Western Shoshone sacred land in violation of the Ruby Valley Treaty of 1863, and it's earthquake-prone and volcanoes. It's a bad site. It can't isolate it. We should get Yucca Mountain off the table, get the centralized interim storage delusion of a solution off the table, and focus on how can we really isolate this waste and store it as well as possible. How urgent? We don't know how quickly. We don't know if before the end of this legislative year, at the end of December, whether this bill, H.R. 2699 or another one, 3136, could get voted on. There was just a subcommittee hearing and it moved through that. It's going to the full committee. There'll be a few committee actions taking place, and it could or could not go to the floor. It's hard to know what goes on in Congress, but it's important, urgent now, because the legislators in New England, most of them, have voted for this bill. I would say maybe just thinking, oh, well, we're going to get it out of here and it's totally safe and they want it there. So what we're here to do is say, no, people don't want it there, and we don't want to trigger years of nuclear waste, high-level waste. Each of these containers has more radioactivity than was released, well, more plutonium than was released from the Nagasaki bomb in each container. And each container has more cesium than was released from Chernobyl. So each of them's a lot. So it's urgent, it's important, and what they need to do is vote down these bills or don't even bring them for a vote. And the only way they'll do that is if we, the citizens, let them know they need to change their stance and protect the country.
And Deb, if you had Congressperson Welch here in front of you right now, what would you say to him? Because he has voted for this bill and it's ongoing.
Well, Welch should be ashamed of himself. I mean, ostensibly, Vermont prides itself on its environmental record and the stance they're taking, and yet they're willing to basically move the deadliest waste we've ever created to a Hispanic community in West Texas. And in fact, Vermont Yankee is sending its ostensibly low-level waste to a Hispanic community in West Texas, which, in fact, Senator Sanders orchestrated to make happen. And the reason why this is also urgent at this point, Diane's talking about the legislation, but it's urgent because you have these limited liability corporations like North Star or Holtec coming in and buying up shuttered nukes with a profit-driven motive at this point, which is we're going to clean the site up as quickly and as cheaply as we can. But to get out from under and make a profit, we've got to get the high-level waste off-site. Because if we're stuck with the waste on site, it's going to cost us $5 million a year at least for 50 years, for 100 years, to hold it on site until there's some scientifically sound and environmentally just solution. So what is happening now is really being orchestrated by the industry and is profit-driven. It is not for the health and safety of the environment or for the communities, whether it's their community or our community. It's just so they can make a buck. Because if they can't do this, then they'll really go under. I mean, this is the linchpin, is getting the waste off-site. And what we need now is not to have a profit-driven solution, not to have an industry controlled by trying to save itself and reinvent itself for climate change, but to actually get the best minds we can, put to creating the best solution, and also securing the waste on site so reactor communities can accept that the waste stays there for a period of time while we're actually working on creating something that will also benefit these communities, because these communities share the issue of being targeted. My community has already been screwed. Leona's has been screwed. We don't want her more screwed. But we also don't want this waste to stay on site forever because it can't. That's the reality. And so we're in this terrible bind together in which the industry tries to pit us against each other. So my job ostensibly is to screw Leona over. That's the job, is to say, I don't worry about it. I don't see Leona. And that's why CAN brings people here. So people see Leona, and it's not so easy to screw somebody you've seen. I mean, that's the idea of it. You wake up, you have to look at the situation, and people have to also accept the responsibility that any solution to this is complicated and difficult and will take time. But in fact, what there has to be a commitment to is actually trying to do it. And there has never been a commitment to that. There's only been obfuscation and boondoggles, basically.
Leona, I don't want the waste at Vermont Yankee here. I want to be through with it. I want it on the road. I want it out there on the trains, on planes, on buses, everything. I want it out. So what do you say to that?
Well, you know, I'm here thanks to CAN for inviting me, and this is actually my second tour. And I actually, you know, coming from the Southwest, have been very privileged to travel a lot. So I've also gone to speak with folks in California, let's say San Onofre, for example, and their nuclear waste is about 100 feet from the ocean, which has a rising sea level, and the beach is getting washed away every day. So they're very concerned. There is an urgency there to move the waste. So the reality is, our communities, we all know each other. We work together nationally. And all we know right now is there are some situations where waste should be moved, but it shouldn't be moved across the country, especially from New England to New Mexico. That would endanger all of the people anywhere in between a nuclear power plant and our area. So what I say to that is, the people who are dealing with the waste right now and who have to live with it, they think, well, let's get it out of here. Let's take it away. It's not safe for us. Let's move it away. But your away is my home, is our homelands, you know. So what's happening is we're having a lot of dialogue nationally to discuss realistically what do we do with this. And so the urgency that you mentioned is almost a false political construct by the industry, and what really needs to happen are some real serious and meaningful dialogues between the impacted communities. It should be a community-driven solution that is not going to endanger all of the people in this country, most of whom don't even know about this waste. When we are doing our outreach, a lot of folks have no idea how dangerous this stuff is. And so when we compare and we talk about, you know, if there was a handful of this high-level waste, like about a meter away or about a yard away, you know, after the span of an hour, if it was unshielded, it could kill a person. I mean, this toxic waste is so lethal and deadly, nobody should be exposed to it. So when your communities want to get the waste out of here, you're basically irradiating and endangering people everywhere, because when those trains that are transporting the waste are moving, there is some radiation that can come out. And what the industry has said, I've heard a representative say, oh, it's just like getting an X-ray. It's okay. But these are how many thousands of shipments, how many thousands of X-rays, you know, without consent. And I don't know how many people have ever taken a train across the country, but if you're just, you know, sitting on the train looking out the window, you know, you see schools, you see people's backyards, you see, you know, children's toys, you know, in the backyard of somebody's house. And the last time I took a train, I just thought, wow, these are all the people who will be exposed if those trains start to transfer this waste. So I come out here not just to the Northeast, but to California, to other parts of the country, to just talk to folks and explain, we know it's dangerous, but does that mean because it's not safe for your communities that it's safe for our communities? So we need to have some really serious discussions that are not driven by politics and economy. We need to find something to do with this waste for the future generations.
And we need to stop making more of it.
Yeah, we need to stop
Still
making
have
more.
Seabrook cooking away, in New England. And fortunately, most of your other nukes are all shut down, but you've got irradiated fuel. They call it spent. It's irradiated for dangerous now and dangerous for millions of years, and it's not okay anywhere. So what we do with it is very important, and we don't just make it like a hot potato political football and transport it to New Mexico, or Texas might be weaker now, and then, well, then they get it together and then they want to send it to a permanent place, and maybe that's up in New Hampshire, which was targeted in the past, and then we'd have it all trucking that way. And it's, we need to stop making more of it, turn off the faucet, and then figure out how to best isolate it. That has to be the goal. Preventing exposures, preventing leakage into the future.
And what about the hardened on-site storage right now at the sites?
Well, there isn't. That's the first thing. There should be. I mean, after 9/11, it became very clear. One of the initial targets was a reactor, and the terrorists decided it would contaminate the world, and so they weren't willing to risk it at that point. But in fact, this waste is vulnerable. I mean, so there's the issue of terrorism, but there's the issue of global warming, which also affects reactors and the waste on site. So that, for example, at Yankee Row, right above Row, is Harrington Dam. It's a huge dam. It basically is right above the reactor. In Hurricane Irene, they were releasing water again and again from the dam. I spoke to the workers there because they were afraid the dam would break. And if the dam would break, the casks at Yankee Row would basically be driven 20 or 30 miles downstream under 20 feet of water to Shelburne Falls. So we talk about what's happening, but all of these sites have these problems because at reactor sites you have to have water to run a reactor. And in fact, you can't have water to protect fuel. So when we talk about hardening, the hardening concept that Ken came up with and worked with a number of scientists on was the idea of making them less vulnerable to terrorism, which would include double walling the casks. It would include berming them in potentially. It would be separating the casks further from each other. We tried to talk to Entergy about this at one point. We actually got the National Academy of Science to do a study about the vulnerability of spent fuel in pools and how important it was to get them in dry casks. And what the NRC has done is nothing about it. And what the industry has done is basically nothing about it. And they want to act as if it's not a problem at all. Because even in Vermont, where we intervened in the lawsuit with the state about the issues of how to protect the fuel, I mean, all Vermont has is a wooden fence around where the high-level waste is. I mean, we're talking about 9/11 terrorists having the ability to knock out some canisters. I suggested they at least paint cows on the fence so that it would look more bucolic if they weren't going to do anything to actually protect people. So I think that would go a long way to help reactor communities stay with the waste on site if they felt they could be more protected in the short run, while there is really a commitment to doing something. The danger for everyone is nobody feels the government is committed to anything but trying to get themselves out of this problem as easily as possible by making someone else miserable and making the waste disappear. So then the industry can say, oh, we do a great job. There's no waste on site anymore. We're the answer to global warming. We're the best thing that came along since sliced bread. Give us all your money again, and we'll solve global warming. And of course, this is ludicrous, and there's a crisis in high-level waste, not just in this country, but across the planet at this point, that is unseen and silent right now. And the issue of raising it is not to make everyone terrified, so then they want it out of their community. It's like this delicate balance. The idea is to actually get some real work done on it. I mean, scientists came up with this really bad idea, and they're really responsible for trying to create a solution that can isolate this from the environment for an ungodly period of time. We're talking about part of the EPA standards is 10,000 years. Part of it is 250,000 years. We're talking about a time when we can't even think of a sign we could put up that people in 200 or 300 years could read and know that it's either too dangerous to touch or it's so dangerous that they want it. I mean, this is the incredible dilemma that that nuclear power and weapons have put us in, so that we're in a situation where there are no good solutions. There are only bad and terrible ones. CIS is terrible.
What is CIS?
Centralized interim storage, what Diane has been talking about. And what we have to find is the least bad, which is really grim to talk about finding the least bad, but that's in fact in ways where we are at this point, which is to find the least bad, the safest, what will protect human health and safety more than anything else. Mm-hmm. That should be the most important thing, not a profit-driven solution, not some plan for an industry to resurrect itself from the dustbin of history.
And I don't want to.
Yep.
Okay. Nuclear power makes climate change worse. So we've mentioned a few times the lie that nuclear might not. And in reality, nuclear steals the resources needed for real answers, real climate answers such as renewables and efficiency. And so the industry is really riding on saying, oh yeah, we're better. But they do make radioactive carbon. They do create enormous amounts of waste that last literally into the millions of years. And so it's not an answer, it makes it worse. It detracts us from the real answers to climate, as well as giving us more issues that we can't solve. So I just wanted to point out that nuclear makes climate change worse. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think something your viewers could do is educate themselves about the nuclear fuel chain, educate themselves about climate change and some of the bills that we mentioned that are in Congress, and to talk to elected officials. I think what Diane said is probably the first step, is to stop making more waste. I know next in December is the next United Nations convening of the whole world to come together to talk about the climate down in Santiago, Chile. So we call it the COP meetings. And what happens internationally at the UN level is that the nuclear lobby is pushing nuclear as a solution to climate change. So there's a lot of misinformation that nuclear is clean, that it's even renewable. There was a bill in New Mexico to try to label nuclear as renewable, and it's not renewable. That's why we say nuclear fuel chain. It's not a cycle. And so I think that's something people need to understand, that just because the exhaust or the stuff that comes out of the cooling towers, they say, oh, it's just steam, it's just water, it's not carbon, it's totally safe and benign. Well, if you count all of the steps from the uranium mining and processing, fuel fabrication, and all the transportation, it's actually pretty carbon intensive. And that's what folks need to hear, is that what Diane said is nuclear makes climate change worse. But the other thing is for folks to know that we need to not just stop making nuclear fuel, and we can't just like transition to some other industry, but we really need to look at our consumption of energy as humans. I mean, we're causing a lot of problems for the future and for the entire planet, and it's not okay. I mean, we have to stop. We have to stop what we're doing and not continue business as usual. At the UN, I've been to the past 2 COP meetings in Bonn, Germany, and in Poland. And at both of these meetings, the current administration was pushing for nuclear as a solution to climate change, as well as more oil and gas development and what they call clean coal. So it's important for everybody to understand that the nuclear industry has deep pockets, and if we don't speak up, they will. So we need people to talk to their elected officials and to be educated about these issues.
And you have been dealing with uranium mining for decades. Is that true?
Well, for about a decade, I started working on.
Right, you're young.
In 2007, I got involved in a fight to stop a new uranium mine in New Mexico. So out here, you all have a lot of water and a lot of resources that people might take for granted in the Southwest. It's a very arid environment, and we can't have nuclear power plants because there's just not enough water. So something that's happening now is a push for what's called small modular reactors and new types of new reactors, which aren't really new, that use less water. But anyways, the uranium mine that was being proposed was a type of solution mining where they actually use the aquifer as a means to extract the uranium. So this is called ISL mining, or in situ leach mining. They actually do it in Nebraska and South Dakota. And what happens is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, knows in order to do this type of mining, you will contaminate the aquifer forever. So companies have to have an aquifer exemption in order to do this type of mining. When I was learning about this back in 2007, it was insane to think that, oh, the EPA just gives this exemption that this company can put, all this stuff in our aquifer and it's impossible to clean. We were successful in stopping it. In 2014, the project it couldn't go forward because of our Navajo Nation law. Our Navajo Nation passed a law that says no uranium mining in 2005 and no transport of radioactive materials in 2012. So it was our tribal government's sovereignty and jurisdiction that put a stop to this for the protection of our people, because the Navajo Nation has been dealing with the uranium contamination, our health problems, and it's very devastating ever since the uranium boom of the mid 20th century, and all of that was for war. So there's a very close connection between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons that people they also don't see that connection. And I think it's really important that when we're talking about nuclear energy and power, we can't neglect the fact that uranium is also used to kill people in other parts of the world. And so our sacred mountain in New Mexico, which is Mount Taylor, has been a place that was mined for both weapons and energy use. So as Indigenous peoples, we see this as what I like to quote my friend Clee Benally. He calls it a slow genocide. So the United States is still committing genocide, is still doing forced relocation, because when our lands become contaminated, some people have to move. So people think, oh, well, that's history, you should get over it. But colonialism is very much alive and well today, especially when you look at the nuclear industry. So this is what our people are living with and dealing with. Right now, there's a bill in Congress called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act Amendments of 2019. And what we're hoping for is a just compensation for people who have died or had their health impacted from mining uranium and processing uranium. So this bill is in Congress now, and we want folks to support it. It was introduced by our Representative Ben Ray Lujan, and this is compensation people have been waiting for decades, and some folks have already died, and it's their descendants who are requesting this compensation. So the RECA, it's called RECA. The RECA amendments cover folks who worked in mines and then also downwinders of nuclear test sites. So in our communities, our people are still living with the impacts and still demanding something be done by the responsible party, which ultimately is the United States government.
The responsible party. Let's talk about responsibility as we will have to come to a close on our brief program. I appreciate so much that you are setting off inaugurating your tour here in Burlington, Vermont, where we do have a community of people who are for peace and against the nuclear industry too. So, but what is the prospect right now?
The prospect for what? The prospect that the industry is going to try to reinvent itself in this. They're going to work very, very hard. They're going to tell a lot of lies. They're going to use a lot of deceit. They're going to put on some very green outfits to look very clean. And they're basically going to attempt to target communities that they feel can't fight back, that don't have the power. And what's really important, why the tour is taking place in New England, not out in Leona's territory, where she is because the waste is here. And we have to be willing to stop it. We have to be willing to stop this industry from the next gambit they're trying to pull in this, which they are going to push for again and again. You know, the nuclear industry is like a vampire. Every time you think you got them down, you got them in the coffin, it's over, they're shutting the nukes, and they rise again. They just keep rising. And so under the Trump administration, they're really attempting to rise. I think in the long run, they'll fail. I don't think these limited liability corporations coming in to clean up nukes are, in fact, going to be successful. When the merchant plants came in, when they deregulated reactors, and all these corporations came in and said, oh, we're going to make a bundle on buying up old tin can nukes and we'll run them forever, what do we have? We have Entergy dumping its nuclear fleet because it couldn't make a profit. It was losing hundreds of millions of dollars. So now we have a bunch of scavengers coming in, the next crew, saying, oh, we're going to make a fortune on decommissioning. And nuclear power is like Tar Baby. Everyone punches Tar Baby, if you can remember Tar Baby, and they get stuck, and they get stuck, and they get stuck again and again. But the only way they'll get stuck is if we wake people up. Because what the industry wants is for everyone to go to sleep, watch Fox News, have a good cocktail, and just go on with their lives, and not understand the level of sacrifice and the danger that's going on right here in Vermont. And we do. We want them to call their legislators, but we want them to talk to their friends. We want to say, hey, you heard this program? Wow, I had my socks knocked off by Leona. She was really great. She was talking about what it's like out in New Mexico, and they're thinking of sending our waste out there. That's immoral. That doesn't make sense. I'm going to call my Representative Welsh and say, what's going on with you? How come you voted for this? How come you're not doing it? And don't do it again. Bad boy, bad boy. That's what we want, is for people to wake up, tell their friends, go to church, speak in church and say, hey, look, there's a real moral problem going on in Vermont at this point, and we don't even know it's going on, and we need to talk about it. That's why we're spreading the word. In a certain way, we're like the abolitionists. Only the modern-day abolitionists around nuclear waste and the issues of who's being targeted and who's being hurt and all the immiserated people who are being put in a position to choose between short-term economic gain and long-term health and safety. And to put someone in that position is immoral and reprehensible, and they have to be told to stop. And they have to, our legislators have to develop the spine, not just to stand up to Trump, but actually to stand up to the industry and say, no, this isn't the solution. This isn't the way to do it. This just is an easy way out for you. We really need a responsible way to deal with this, and this isn't it.
So we've had victories on this exact same fight over and over again since I started doing this work in the 1970s. So in the threat we have right now, we've got nuclear waste at 100 plus reactors around the country. It can't stay there forever. We have no permanent place to isolate it, no permanent method to isolate it. The one that we're pretending we have at Yucca Mountain simply cannot work. And so what are we doing instead? Oh, well, we'll just put it temporarily in New Mexico, Texas, in the area there. We'll just put it there temporarily. Meanwhile, we'll have a major campaign of all this irradiated fuel, which is hotter than the whole rest of the fuel chain, and put it on roads and rails through communities and supposedly store it there. So that now the name for these sites is Consolidated Interim Storage, or CIS. Well, the last acronym was called Monitored Retrievable Storage, and that's they were trying to put those in West Virginia and in Tennessee, and in the 80s we were able to stop the MRSs. There were efforts to entice local and state governments, the Mescalero in
Yeah.
Apaches in the Southwest,
Right.
the Prairie Island Nation.
The Goshutes.
Yeah, so there have been a bunch of places that were offered the opportunity, and the Goshutes actually licensed it, but it never operated. But the other sites that were supposedly going to have these monitored retrievable storage, high-level waste, irradiated concentration, it got stopped through various people coming to their senses and realizing it doesn't make sense. We've got a threat of it becoming permanent here. We have a threat of it being reprocessed, which could make nuclear weapons with the fuel itself, and the dangers all along the way. Before that, we're looking in the late 1970s, the phrase for the same concept was AFR, away from reactor storage. And they wanted to move it to where I'm from, in Western New York, place in Illinois, place in South Carolina. They actually built reprocessing plants in those places to bring it in and start making bigger messes. And West Valley is the only place they made the mess. But people stopped that. Congress did not approve away from reactor storage in its first nuclear waste, low-level waste law and nuclear waste law. The monitored retrievable storage got stopped around the country, and now we're faced with consolidated interim storage. It's the same fight. It's the same illogic. It's the same danger. It's extremely higher now because we've got so much more waste, 80,000 metric tons and growing, and we can stop it again. It's all we need to do is
The thing that makes it harder is the number of reactors that have shuttered.
Yep.
So we're under a situation, back then reactors were operating. So the issue was of getting the waste out off-site. But you have many reactors shuttered because the industry can't compete. And those...
with other energy sources.
With other energy sources, exactly. And so you have a situation in which there's pressure not then just from the industry, but from communities that have been harmed by the nuclear waste and the reactors, in terms of wanting the waste off-site, and states who want the waste off-site because they're terrified they're going to become responsible for basically guarding a high-level nuclear waste dump for centuries to come. So this makes it, in some ways, a more intense fight than it's been, but we, as Diane said, have won, and it is possible to win again. It's about people knowing that there's a fight going on. The biggest danger is the fight goes on and everyone's sleeping. They're reading their
That's
paper.
why I think H.R. 3053, this bad bill passed last year, is that Congress hadn't dealt with nuclear in a long time, and our reps across the country weren't educated.
Right.
Now we've got some time, we educate them, and we don't have a repeat of that mistake.
Right.
It's gonna become more prevalent in the news as more and more reactors start shutting down. And I've been, like I said, I travel a lot. I visited a community in France where they are trying to do the same thing in Bure. And the community there, it's pretty isolated. It's a rural place, like Deb was saying, where we live in New Mexico. We only have 5 people in Congress, so we don't have the political clout as much as, like, say, California or New York. In Spain, there was also a proposal for a CIS site there. That it's a different name in Spanish, but their communities were also fighting it, and it's, you know, away from the urban areas. So what happens is the nuclear industry can only succeed if it's operating in secrecy. So if they're going to, their plan is to, you know, move the waste away from the urban areas, and that doesn't mean that there's nobody living out there. So if you see a picture of New Mexico where Holtec wants to build its site, it looks empty. People might think it's a wasteland and it's desolate, but it's not. This is where we live. This is where our communities have lived for centuries. And so indigenous peoples, we've lived out in the desert for thousands of years. And so if your folks out here think, oh, nobody lives out there, it's not going to hurt anyone, the population density is expendable, that's just not true. And so this is what's happening all over the world. There's communities that are dealing with the waste problem because more and more reactors are getting old and they're shutting down. And you're going to keep hearing about this more and more as all of them start to shut down. And so we need to deal with it, you know, before it gets too late.
Well, we want them to hear about it. We don't want it to be silent.
No,
we want
that's why we're
it's like
here.
having every who in Whoville yell about this. That's what we're working towards. See, this is our work, is to wake every who up to yell as loud as they can. So Representative Welsh hears those who's and says, uh-oh, I have to reconsider this. Or Senator Sanders goes, uh-oh, I have to reconsider my support for centralized interim storage, which he has had at times. And it's, uh-oh, I have to reconsider supporting Yucca Mountain, a failed boondoggle. And so every who in Whoville wakes up, and then we can stop it from happening again. And that's always what it takes.
And that includes Senator Leahy, too.
And
You didn't
Senator
mention
Leahy,
that.
who has supported Yucca Mountain in the past.
Okay, let's join hands and let's tell them, wake up.
Wake up now! Move it once, do it right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, viewers. Till next time. Wake up. So, okay.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.